Welcome to the Six Bridges Book Festival. I'm your moderator, Stephanie Newton, and I'm so excited to be here today with authors Carolyn Farrell and Lauren Oyler. I'm going to introduce them and then let each read a passage from their books, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. A little bit of housekeeping first. There's a chat function at the bottom of the screen or to the right where you can ask some questions. Please do this. We want you involved. We want to hear what you want to find out from Carolyn and Lauren while we have them here. In the chat, I've included links to each author's website and the Central Arkansas Library Systems page where you can go buy these books. And lastly, we are just so thankful to all the sponsors of the Book Fest and supporters of CALS who make this event possible year after year, whether we're in person or virtual. Okay, so a little bit more about these talented people and their books. Carolyn Farrell is the author of award-winning short story collection, Don't Erase Me. Her short stories have been published in Best American Short Stories, as well as publications such as Literary Review and Fiction Magazine. Her first novel, Dear Miss Metropolitan, this is it, was released this summer. Carolyn joins us from New York, where she's a faculty member and professor of writing at Sarah Lawrence College. Lauren Oyler writes about culture, the internet, and the state of literature in essays for outlets such as Harper's, London Review of Books, New York Times Magazine, and many others. She's been a ghostwriter and book reviewer, and Fake Accounts, released in February, is her first novel. She splits her time between Berlin and upstate New York, which is where she joins us from today. I encourage you to click on their author websites, follow them on social media, keep up with what they've got going on. And now I'm going to hand it over to them to read a little bit, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So first to Carolyn, and I'll just say feel free to give as much context around what's happening as you want, or feel free to just jump right in.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And thank you, Nathan. And hi, Lauren. I didn't get the chance to say hi to you earlier. And I definitely want to know about Berlin. I lived in West Berlin years and years ago. So we have a lot to talk about. Thank you again, Stephanie, for inviting me to this lovely event. I'm just going to talk a little bit about, just briefly, in a nutshell, if I can do it. This book is not a nutshell kind of book, but this is a story of three young girls who are kidnapped, held hostage, and eventually liberated from a dilapidated house in Queens, New York. And the book features not only their story, but the story of the different communities, the various stories of the different communities around these girls. So the community in which they were held hostage, that community did not even notice that they were gone, the community of mothers, of friends, school teachers, etc. So it's a book that really focuses not just on the girls' experience, but on the experience of trauma and grief around them. So I'm going to read a small section that's entitled The Old College Try. And in this section, the girls, two of them, Fern and Gwenny, have been locked up, and they think they're alone in the house, but they're discovering that they're discovering one another in the house. So I'm just going to read a short section from The Old College Try. So you all know what's about to happen. But before you get to those waterworks, another interruption. Dig, if you will, the picture. Two girls smiling. No, they are not in the boardwalk at Coney Island or Rockaway Beach, but their faces are about to break open. In other words, they're smiling the biggest watermelons God has ever seen. God, in fact, had to step back and admire his handiwork. Damn, did I do that? The girls' faces are bruised, their hands grimy gray. Chains, maybe barbed wire, snake into their silhouette. From the one side, they look like angels, even if they're on the cusp of their most gruesome decade ever, because no amount of house dirt can hide those cherubic cheeks. From the other side, they look like the devil. No, they are not possessed, nor have they been drugged into altered states. These girls are cheery, One could even go so far as to say that they are buoyant. And though they are moments away from being slung farther apart by big, huge, meaty man hands, the girls are positively upbeat. They have discovered each other. One time, two time, three. It's a secret, but they feel like shouting to the world, I am not alone. In the flash of a microscopic eye, they see each other's outlines and forget all doom and gloom. Forget that just moments ago, they believed they would die here all by themselves, forgotten, left behind like so much dust bunny dirt. The truth is, the girls have found a way to one another. They found that if they claw against the sheetrock / floors / ceilings and find a gash or a slash in the fortifications, they can actually see one another, gaze upon a new countenance. You, you, you. These girls are, as per the poem that Mr. Canton made us read, even though we were in Western Civ 1, surprised by joy, impatient as the wind, we turn to share the transport. Oh, with whom? Each other, Natch. These girls are relieved. It was as if they'd suddenly been blanked into normal girls in a normal world, a normal queens, flip phones on faces and Game Boys in pockets. Gwen and me recognize eyes and noses, and in general, the full flavor of our faces. And we try to reach our cheeks with our hands, but damn those chains. Never mind, at least we can see. You. Our imaginations rev back up. Gwen and I saw ourselves almost as if we were two characters in a book of fairy tales, two fun-loving females flaneuring around Flushing Meadows Park, or else strolling the ever-enticing Queens Center Mall, or dipping into an empty church, about to take it over the way church should be taken over. Our fingers, worn to the nubs in only 14 days or 14 months, felt like piano keys. I can hear your breath. No, I can hear yours. Can you sing something just so I know you're real? We didn't dare say boss man's name, our captor, but we thought it many times, the air around us souring as if we were quiet in our minds. But who could be quiet? Miracles were taking place. The hole in the dividing wall, concrete, muslin, cardboard, grew larger right before our eyes. There was no house wind, no toppling. I was a real shadow, and so was she, even if all we could ask was over and over again, are you there? And answer, I am, and widen our eyes in astonishment. Does this mean? Does this mean? Does this mean? And soften our faces with each iteration. How can it not? I won't tell you everything that immediately came after that. It's so much. I'll leave that to your own fruitful imaginations. What I will share instead are the following fairy tales. They did happen to Gwen and me. Our voices ran like boulevards to and from each other. Do you remember what pizza tastes like? Hell, I can't even remember what pizza is. To hear a voice is to beg for a story. Our bones soon understood that we weren't each other's rescues, not in the freedom sense we'd begged for. Her profile and mine were all we had. Boss man's victims, his dolls, his fatalities, his targets, his babushkas, his casualties, his don't call us victims because we're so much more than that. We eventually stopped crying. We told each other our nicknames. We asked the obligatory mother questions. We told each other stories. We promised one another we'd remain strong. We rejoiced a handful of minutes in human time. I'm Gwen, and maybe I can help you. I'm Fern. I mean the same thing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I love going back to that. I'd forgotten about that scene where they first meet. Lauren, let's hear from Fake Accounts.
Sure. I'm just going to read from the very beginning of Fake Accounts because I'm interested in talking to Carolyn a little bit about working from the news. And as you will see, my novel is sort of using the news as well in a very different way. Consensus was the world was ending or would begin to end soon. If not by exponential environmental catastrophe, then by some combination of nuclear war, the American two-party system, patriarchy, white supremacy, gentrification, globalization, data breaches, and social media. People looked sad on the subway and the bars. Decisions were questioned, opinions rearranged. The same grave epiphany was dragged around everywhere. We were transitioning from an only retrospectively easy past to an inarguably more difficult future. We were, it could no longer be denied, unstoppably bad. Although the death of any hope for humanity was surely decades in the making, the result of many intersecting systems described forbiddingly well, it was only that short period between the election of a new president and his holding up a hand to swear to serve the people's interests that made clear what had happened, that we were too late. I didn't believe all of this necessarily, though as the news got worse and more bizarre, I wavered. I've always been drawn to pragmatism, just not exactly a natural at it. As my brain said, calm down, my heart said, also weirdly calmly, a paradoxical comfort can be found in drama. It was and still is my official position, if you were to ask me at a party or something, that the popular turn to fatalism could be attributed to self-aggrandizement and an ignorance of history. History being characterized by the population's quickness to declare apocalypse finally imminent despite its permanently delayed arrival. We don't want to die, but we also don't want to do anything challenging, such as what living requires. So the volubility with which certain doom was discussed made a tedious kind of sense. The end of the world would have us let us have our cake and eat it too. We would have no choice but to die, a potential conveniently unrealizable due to our collapse. Until such time, the illusion that everything was totally pointless now was seductive, particularly as a mantra you could take advantage of when it suited you and then abandon when life actually started to feel alarming. I myself was soon using it to indulge some of my naughtier impulses, by which I mean that in the first hours of a morning in early January, when the sky was still dark and the government still inevitably hurtling, I decided to snoop through my boyfriend's phone while he was asleep. And I'll just stop there.
Awesome, thank you. I love her deciding to snoop through his phone. That's great. Thank you both. Let me just say I found both your books so fascinating. They were unusual and unpredictable, and I found myself trying to explain to people what they were about and then being like, I'm not even going to try to, I don't want to give anything away. You're just going to have to pick this up. I find myself to be kind of a gullible reader. So I was sitting there being like, now wait, is this real? Is this like, can I trust this? And most times in both, I probably should not be trusting what I was being told. So I love that kind of book. It makes me want to read it a second time to pick up all the nuance I might have missed the first time, and just really well done. And I want to commend you all for both for that. I had a first question that I think I want to throw away for now and jump straight to what Lauren was interested in talking about, which was the news and drawing ideas for your fiction from what's going on in the world, because I think both of you really, I know Carolyn, what the news story you drew from came, I think you've been working on this book 8 years, is that right? So
I started in 2013. So yeah,
okay.
8 years. My math is bad, sorry.
Yeah, so y'all tell me and tell the audience, please, about how you were inspired maybe by what was going on to write your books. Let's start.
Lauren, do you want to start?
Oh, I mean, I'm really actually interested in, as I said, I'm really interested in what you have to say so I can get mine out of the way. Basically, I just felt like we were I started this book right at the beginning of January 2017. And everybody was saying all these things about how, like, you could not write fiction about the news as it was happening. Donald Trump was too crazy. You know, you couldn't, and simultaneously also there was a longer conversation going on about how you couldn't really capture the way that social media works in fiction. And I was really like, I don't know, I'm sort of bratty in this way. And I was like, well, maybe I can do it, you know, and I really like a challenge. So I thought, how can I sort of realistically use the news, not necessarily as plot, but as like a scene setting and as the sort of, as the mood and the atmosphere, without making it too like sound too much like an op-ed in the newspaper, or to sound too much like, to make it super dated. And the issue of dating it also was sort of interesting to work around when thinking about social media as well, because I think that there are lots of pitfalls and traps that you can fall into as a writer when you're talking about things that are contemporary, because you don't necessarily know which way the wind is going to blow. And so that was very exciting for me as well.
What about you, Caroline?
Well, it's interesting what you were saying, Lauren, because I always think about what's going on in the world, and I feel like I guess every writer would say this of their age, but what's happening in the world really lends itself to kind of universal themes, and that's really what got me thinking about writing this book. I mean, a lot of people, with reason, think about the Ariel Castro case, and that was definitely a kind of grim inspiration for my book. In reality, though, there were and still are many cases of captivity. I mean, there was that case in Austria, that horrific case.
Mm-hmm.
And, there were a lot of things that inspired me. I was actually thinking a lot about fairy tales. And before I started writing this book, and once I thought about, once I had, read everything about Ariel Castro and what happened to these young women, I knew that I didn't want to write a true crime story. They're still alive, those women who emerged from that house. And I just didn't feel it was my story to tell. But their story had so many, again, these universal themes of not being seen, not being heard, women not being seen, not being heard, women's oppression. And that really spoke to me. I just one last thing, I don't usually watch crime shows, but I happened to watch a crime show once in which a Black woman who had been kidnapped, she was a sex worker, she'd been kidnapped and held hostage, and eventually convinced her kidnapper, who held her and multiple women in his basement, she convinced him to let her go to a payphone. This was after months, to call her family, to tell them she was all right. And when she got to this payphone, it was at a gas station, she found there just happened to be two cops there. And she went to them and said, I've been kidnapped, I've been held hostage, you've got to help me. And they just laughed in her face. They thought she was some strung out prostitute, and they didn't take her seriously. And she had to beg for about 10 minutes for them to take her seriously. And then they went back with her to the house, and they found the rest of the women, including one of whom had died in the basement. So again, that idea of not being heard, not being seen, not being taken seriously, that really spoke to me. And the Ariel Castro case was kind of a catalyst for me to kind of jump into this material.
There's a lot of darkness in both of these stories. Did either of you find yourselves needing to take a break from it to kind of reset or anything? Or once you're in it, are you just like, nope, this is where I'm going, and it's okay to dig myself down in this kind of dark hole to get there?
I think one of the things that I was thinking about was this sort of like idea among sort of middle upper class people that they needed to feel, there's this like tension where they can sort of watch everything going on around them, right? And everything is so terrible, but then actually nothing bad is happening to them. And in the case of the Donald Trump presidency, which is a sort of a very general description of like what was happening in the news at the time that I was writing this book, actually many wealthy people were benefiting from it. But they had this sort of like cognitive dissonance whereby they were like, everything's so terrible, and sort of like embodying the suffering that they were imagining other people were embodying, even though they had absolutely very little access to these stories. And I was trying to sort of, examine that space, which is dark in a completely different way from what Carolyn is talking about, right? And this sort of like psychological, like this, like the depths of, I think someone said banal sociopathy. So like absolutely just boring people sort of backstabbing each other for no real reason, like lying to each other and having these sort of vague motivations that are really hard to identify, I think was quite interesting for me, because usually I think when you talk about writing a plot or something, right, like one of the key things that you need to determine are the characters' motivations, what they want, right, is what we often hear in a writing class. And I felt like I was surrounded by people who you couldn't determine their motivations for why they were acting the way that they were acting, the way that people act on social media. You would just sort of watch them and you would just think, what is going on in this person's head? And so the novel deals with a woman who snoops through her boyfriend's phone because she thinks basically he's cheating on her or something. He's just acting kind of weird. And instead of finding, you know, other women in his phone, she finds that he is a really popular conspiracy theorist on Instagram, and he's got like sort of, you know, tens of thousands of followers, and he is posting all this sort of outrageous conspiracy theory stuff. But she can never really determine if he actually believes it, right? So the thing that sort of got me interested in this was one of my boyfriend at the time wrote an article about Instagram conspiracy theorists, and this was before QAnon. This was before all of this, you know, it became a sort of major feature of the news. It was just a sort of like kitschy human interest story. But the thing that was really interesting to me when he was interviewing these conspiracy theorists was that we couldn't determine if these guys, and they were mostly guys in their 20s, like we couldn't determine if they actually thought it, or if they were just doing like a project, or they were bored, or they wanted to see how many followers they could get. And it was really sort of fascinating from that perspective.
Yeah, that's certainly depressing in its own way. And Carolyn, what about you?
Well, that's so interesting. You know, I think that when I was writing this book, I don't think I ever took a break because this is going to sound really weird. The story is incredibly dark, but as I was inhabiting the characters, I was not thinking about that darkness. I was thinking about other things. I was thinking about you know, how they were building their world, how they were surviving, you know, and just really trying to inhabit, you know, their characters through and through. But something else that I thought about as I was writing, you know, you really don't want to overwhelm your reader. And one of their strategies, I think, it was to really use humor. You know, humor is a way to kind of restore humanity. And I had a friend of mine who read the book said, I don't know, I've never read a book where Judge Judy is referenced so often. And, you know, it was important for me to have that in the book, that, you know, they, not everything is sad 100% of the time. They have to still, you know, hold on to something, you know, so much of their lives, you know, 97% is sad and traumatic, but they have to have that balance in order to feel like human beings. So for me, what I really concentrated on was a kind of world building where they would build a world in which they'd be able to survive. And it, in the House of Horrors, as it's called in the book, that world building really had to do with female friendship, you know, and just really exploring those bonds.
Yeah, that leads me to one of my questions I had about make-believe in kind of both like a good and bad way. I'm glad you read the part of your book, or part of it, that talks about fairy tales, because this is in its way kind of a fairy tale, and the girls tell each other fairy tales. They make up lies for each other to help themselves get through this. But then Lauren, your book also deals in a lot of lies and deceptions and make believe in that way. So yeah, I want to hear about why y'all were drawn to these themes, and how your books explore all the many lies and that we tell ourselves and other people.
Well, I could just answer quickly. I mentioned that I was really interested in fairy tales, and I felt like, you know, originally I had kind of framed this whole book in the fairy tale of the three bears. You know, Goldilocks, she enters a house where she's not welcome. You know, she just kind of enters this house, but she also becomes victimized. And, you know, that archetype, two children wander into the woods, or one child wanders into the woods, what happens next? I was really compelled by that. I was thinking about Sleeping Beauty, and I held on to the fairy tale ideas, and I definitely tried to weave things in. But as I began writing, other concerns became more important for me. And there was something about the fact that these girls had been locked away for 10 years that I found really unbelievable in real life. And it was it was surreal. How could girls go missing for 10 years, and it happens all the time. It's still happening, but the fairy tale form, this is just to say that the fairy tale form really shifted for me. And I started to think about the fairy tale form in other ways, and one way that was particularly important was this idea of fragmentation, that just the book is told in all different types of not only voices, but different forms. There are newspaper articles and documents and interviews, etc. And that really kind of took over fairy tales as a narrative a decision for me. Telling it in this sort of fragmented way, I was able to incorporate everything: fairy tales, news, etc., etc. So yeah.
Even some of your own photographs.
And photographs also. Yeah, I wanted to just kind of throw everything in there and, hope that the details would resonate.
Yeah. I definitely want to talk more about fragments and that structure, but Lauren, also tell us your thoughts on kind of the themes and why you wanted to go there.
Yeah, well, I think you said something about this, the sort of real story that the real news story was quite unbelievable. And I think that too, it's trying to tell a story that is unbelievable in fiction as opposed to nonfiction, right? So people are attracted to true crime for all sorts of reasons, but part of it is like, there's none of this. You don't have to suspend your disbelief, right? You can be shocked by the true crime, and you know that it's true, and the shock is sort of like legitimized somehow. It was very interesting to me to see unbelievable things happening in the world, and then thinking about the sort of the concept of something being stranger than fiction, or too strange for fiction because you wouldn't believe it, right? And I'm like, okay, what can I do to express that idea in a novel that the reader is going into knowing that it is fictional? So some of the other concern, the plot is basically this unnamed protagonist discovers that her boyfriend is a conspiracy theorist, and she decides that she is going to break up with him. But before she can break up with him, something happens, and she sort of has a kind of strange breakdown and moves to Berlin because this is in part because this is where they met. And she becomes, she starts kind of mirroring his behavior, and she starts making up different personalities everywhere she goes. So she doesn't know anyone in Berlin. So she has a total blank slate, and she comes up with a different life for herself everywhere that she goes, including on many online dates. So every time she goes on a date, she takes on the personality of a different zodiac sign or whatever. And I think part of what was interesting to me was thinking like, she really wants someone to call her out on how sort of weird she's being, and like how she's being kind of unbelievable, and nobody does. And because like nobody really cares that she's kind of strange and like telling these sort of slightly bizarre, slightly unbelievable tales. And she sort of becomes like more and more alienated because she's lying, but also because she like wants someone to not believe her, which becomes like a sort of weird inverse of what you usually want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to hear more about how you built that character, honestly. And I know there's some kind of maybe autobiographical bits here, but for both of you, I'd love to hear more about building these characters. Lauren, in Fake Accounts, we get so much of this inner monologue of this one character that is like, it seems overwhelming to me to be able to piece all that together. we know what she's thinking when she's scrolling Twitter and when she's Googling something and when she's like tripping on the sidewalk and stuff. And then same question to you, Carolyn, about building these three really believable characters that are trapped in the house with Boss Man.
I can just answer really quickly. So part of what I was thinking about was like the idea of fiction and the idea of a sort of autofiction, right? And how autofiction works, which is the reader is told that what they're reading is fictional, what they're reading is not true, but actually it's very clear that much of it is autobiographical, right? And I was interested in sort of playing with that. So part of the development of the character was quite easy because you can just I took, for example, my own Twitter profile picture and sort of like use it as her profile picture. But also I was interested in making her seeing how you can do characterization without giving away basically any details about her. So she doesn't tell you you really don't learn very much about this narrator at all. I think you learn that she's from like a red state. At one point she makes a joke about being from a red state, and she's that she starts the book as a blogger. She writes maybe 3 or 4 sort of little articles per day at a website like Vice or Gawker or one of these websites. But your understanding of her, and I hope that you get like a deep understanding of her, comes entirely through her thought process and not through these sort of like little details, the kind of thing that you would share on a dating profile, for example. So from that perspective, it was kind of easier because I could just, all I had to do was a sort of like negative space of like world building where I just can't have there being contradictory elements, right? Like, but I don't, you need to make her seem sort of incredibly specific, but also really vague. So that was the challenge rather than like, constructing in the sort of typical way that you think, like you make like you write some notes about like she has brown hair or whatever, like she broke her arm when she was 4 and, whatever, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I love reading a book like that because often I'm like 100 pages in and then I'm like, we don't even know her name. Like, how did I get this far? And I'm just now realizing, she's kind of an outline of a person, but I know every thought.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think a lot about autobiography and fiction, and my great conclusion, which is not in any way original, is that everything that we write is autobiographical. I clearly have not, or I don't know if anyone knows this, maybe people don't know it. I was never locked up for 10 years. I did not have these experiences, but I knew that to undertake this book, I would have to see the world through the eyes of these girls. And I would have to see, there are times when the girls are unreliable, there are times when the reader definitely knows more than the girls do. And that was really tricky. Sometimes I'm asked which character was the hardest to write. And they, I had to inhabit the characters. I had to make their personalities quite distinct. But one of the girls who was kidnapped eventually falls in love with her kidnapper, and she becomes pregnant. It's a little bit of a spoiler. And she envisions a life with him. That was a really difficult thing for me to write. The other girls had their own challenges, but the fact that this character was in such denial was really, really hard. And yet it was also, as a fiction writer, a fantastic challenge. I loved it, but it was really difficult, and I wanted her to ring true, obviously. I wanted it to be authentic. So I incorporated a lot of things into, Jasenia's way of seeing the world, including poetry. They each have something that they kind of glom onto. The Fern is the thing that lifts her up is Soul Train, which in my life was every Saturday morning, everyone watched Soul Train, in the 70s, everyone watched Soul Train Saturday at 11 o'clock in the morning. And for Gwenny is she's a huge Prince fan, and I'm a huge Prince fan, but I have a friend, my best friend actually, who is the kind of person that used to travel around the world to see Prince, and I'm definitely not in that category. I don't think there's anyone I would travel. So I had these elements from my own life, but Jasenia was different, and I she has all of this emotional baggage, and she is, as I mentioned, in denial. But I did give her a love of poetry that I thought would really help her, and
Mhm.
I could say that in my life, I love poetry. I hope almost everyone loves poetry. But there was something about poetry that was redeeming, that was a kind of getaway from the bleakness, So this is a long-winded answer to your question, but everything we write comes out of our, experience, out of our baggage. And just as a writer, I think you really have to be selective about it.
Yeah, I'm glad you talked about Jacinia in particular, because that those parts are hard to read too. I mean, it's just so hard to watch someone that you want, and not that there is a lot she could do about it, but you just want to shake them and be like, this is not it. But yeah, those were hard to read, but really beautifully written.
Thank you.
I want to come back to the structure of both your books. You kind of, very much challenged the conventional structure of a novel that a lot of people might think of, whether it's the narrator kind of talking to the reader, or, like you said, Carolyn, your book has several different ways of telling the story through documents. Lauren's book has a whole section of it told in fragments too. So I would love for y'all to just talk about what led you to structure these books the way you did, and what you think that adds to the story.
I think so. When I first started writing the book, I knew there are two twists in it. And so I knew I came up with that at first. And I thought it was, they're sort of funny. It's like a bit satirical. And I was like, that's very funny. But then I had these, sort of signposts that I could get to. So I just had to write more or less chronologically to get to each of the twists. And that was quite useful. And I really wanted the book to feel like someone is gossiping to you, or someone that maybe a bit, but this acquaintance, you run into her at a party and she's like, oh my God, you'll never believe what happened to me. And then she's telling it to you. And so that's why the narrator is quite close to the reader, right? She's sort of giving you that kind of like distanced, that sort of distance intimacy that we get sometimes in that situation, right? Like you feel like she's telling you something and then you walk away and you're like, I have no idea. I know nothing about this person.
And I love even that she's like, I'm telling it to you this way because of this. I've chosen to tell it to you in this way.
Right. And it's all very like controlled and strategic, and you can see her sort of machinating throughout. And I think on the one hand, I really have always loved metafiction, and I've always loved sort of postmodern, like experimental, satirical kind of literature. But on the other hand, I was thinking about the way that we gossip, right? And I think when we're gossiping, we often refer to the fact that we're gossiping or the fact that we're telling a story, right? So we'll like be in the middle and we'll say, okay, I'm going to go back to that in a second, but first I have to tell you this part. Or like we have to flash forward a couple of years, and she is married to this other guy now or whatever, right? So
That's
we're often
true.
sort of like referring to our narrative strategies. So in that way, I don't think it's so experimental, but it is divided into beginning, middle, and end in this way. And I think that's just in part because I like to refer to the fact that it's a book that you're reading. You know that it's a book. I know that it's a book. The narrator knows that it's a book, and we're all sort of like on the same page in that way. And then there's a long section in the middle where it's most of the book is like long paragraphs, sort of digressive, like very animated. And then there's a long section in the middle, and the narrator has gotten this job, which I also had, not necessarily babysitting, but walking these babies every morning, because the people that she's working for are artists and they work from home and they want the babies out of the house. So she gets paid €7 an hour to like walk this stroller with these twins in it. And while she's doing this, she listens to podcasts all the time, and she's listening to author interviews. And she hears an interview with this author, and she says, I wrote my book in fragments because it's very feminine, and I've written I've written it like this because it's essentially a female form. And the narrator is very irritated by this, but also the narrator is sort of seeking a form for her life as well. So she sort of like ironically, but also seriously, is the next section is I'm going to write in fragment, maybe I'll understand this if I try it myself. And so then she goes off on her fragment journey, which is, it's sort of satirizing a very particular kind of fragmentary narrative that has been very popular over the last 10 years. It's not really the same kind of fragments that Carolyn is talking about at all. It's really this sort of aphoristic, short, meaningful, declarative little tiny sections, lots of white space in the book. And this is not really what Carolyn is doing in any way. But it was also quite useful because she's going on a lot of OkCupid dates, and you can have this episodic little thing it's quite funny and really fun to write, frankly.
Yeah, I like it when she goes off on a way too long of a tangent and then it's like, oops, I forgot this is not the form I was supposed to be following. I messed up.
Yeah.
What about you, Carolyn? Yeah, revisit what you're.
No, I'm sorry. I that's so great, and I know exactly what kind of book you're referring to, Lauren. It's really impossible to read. I know. The fragmentation was a strategy of survival for these girls, and it. That was one way, I guess, that I wanted the reader to really feel what they were feeling. And, what is it like when you don't have actual food, you have pictures of food to eat? What is it like when there should be a dining room, but it's actually called pass-through chasm, or you spend time locked up in a washing machine, so it's this really strange world that I was trying to build, that I wanted the reader to experience. And, I had to think about, recently, in terms of fragmentation, I had to think about, this horrible case of Gabby Petito, that really rocked the nation. And one of the things that I was hoping that my book would call attention to were the numbers of Black and brown girls who go missing. And what happened to this girl, Gabby Petito, was horrible. But in the same sort of way that I was thinking about this in my book, we everyone in the United States is focused on this girl. She is the typical kind of victim that people focus on, blonde, pretty young girl. But what came out of that was, people saying, well, what about, Native American women, and so that was also kind of fragmented. What about Native American women who've been lost, and I think The Guardian had an article recently that said every day 4 Black women in the United States went missing. So wow. I thought about that, and it's, if you really put that in your mind, it's just your mind becomes fragmented. How can that be? So the fragmentation that the girls in my book experience in terms of just simple things like eating and sleeping, everything is, they just have to relearn it, and I thought that would be a really good way to immerse the reader the best way into the book. When I first wrote Dear Miss Metropolitan, the original draft was a linear narrative. It was beginning, middle, and end. And there were very few tangents. Because when I started to write it, I thought, well, what is my reader moving towards? They're reading towards liberation, of course. The girls they have a life before, they're kidnapped, held hostage, and then they're liberated. Mm-hmm. And when I got to the end of that, first of all, it was only 100 pages. So I knew it wasn't a novel. But then I realized there's so much missing. There are all the voices of the people around them, the community, they're the voices of the old women. They're the voices of, Dear Miss Metropolitan, the people who have survivor's guilt, who were around the whole time, and they knew something was off, but they didn't think to really investigate it. So that was sort of what I was thinking about with this fragmentation, was that it just kind of had tentacles that spread out everywhere, so yeah.
Yeah. Thinking of Gabby Petito, I'm thinking even that we all know her name. And in the book, when these girls emerge, they're known as the victim females. Like, I don't think people, like you said, people don't even necessarily realize they're missing. So that really highlights the different way they're treated.
Right.
Actually, I have a question. Can you talk about the way that you're thinking about media? The Gabby Petito case is obviously that happened after you were done with the book, but part of it is like the way that social media works, right? And a cute blonde girl in the past was a very sort of like winning news story. And now she I don't know if she was necessarily an influencer before she went missing, but the way that the case exploded on social media, the fact that she had created these sort of like perfect images of herself and her boyfriend going on their travels really created this perfect storm for the story. And I think that your book is really interesting because you have lots of groups of people, right? Like even the girls are in a group, and there's so much fragmentation, right? But there's also a lot about, I don't really know what I'm asking, but I'm just wondering if you could talk about mediation and the way that people receive these stories and what you wanted to express, even particularly with the character of Miss Metropolitan herself, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, Miss Metropolitan, I kind of wanted to shake everyone out of their comfort zone, if I, could put it that way. Miss Metropolitan, she fancies herself a journalist, a newspaper woman, as she says. And she's been doing, she's been letting everyone kind of lead her around her whole life. And when she realizes what has happened, everything kind of comes into focus for her, that she realizes that she is a part of this, and even worse, that she's a part of the problem. It's interesting to think about Gabby Petito, because I think she was an influencer. And, I think about that scene in real life where the cops came, and, that I just felt was right in Dear Miss Metropolitan territory. The cops came and they were like, well, nothing we can do, and then just left. And they didn't take her seriously, Interestingly, I was just at a reading recently by Anita Hill. Her new book is all about, taking women seriously and how things will not change until, sexual violence and women's voices are taken seriously. And she asked, why is it in the Larry Nassar case with the Olympic gymnasts, why did all these girls have to testify? Why did they have to do all of this? Why in the Kavanaugh hearings, Christine Ford, why was she, why can't you believe women? And that was sort of a guiding principle for me. Do we actually believe women? And the answer is usually no. I don't know if this is answering your question, Lauren, but it was definitely something that I was thinking about the whole time is, what's our responsibility? What's our responsibility to these girls? And for some people in Dear Miss Metropolitan, they suppressed it. They, it was like, well, I'm not really a part of it, even though they knew they were. But for others like Matilda Maron, she just couldn't get over it. She just could not get over the fact that she survived and that she saw something was wrong, but she didn't act on it. Yeah. So, yeah.
I just want to put out there a reminder. We've got about 15 minutes left, a little less. If anyone's got any questions, if you want to drop them in the chat, that would be awesome. I want to hear a little bit from each of you about what your writing process is like. Are you, really regimented, wake up and write this time every day, or is it just sneaking it in when you can? Lauren, you go first. Tell us a little bit about your writing process.
It's like an anti-process. I really don't. I write a lot for magazines, which does provide a deadline structure. And I find that the more that I have to do, the more fiction stuff or the more sort of irresponsible writing that I will get done, because I use one to procrastinate for the other, which is great. But no, I wish when I was living in Berlin and I was, early 20s, I would I did have like a bit of a regime, and I would wake up early and write, and like, then I don't even know what I would do, or I would write for like so long because I didn't have very many responsibilities. And now it's just sort of like, it's not that I'm too big, I want to be clear, like I'm not too big, I'm not very busy, right? Like I just still just do it whenever it sort of arises that I need to do it or should do it. So maybe my regime is like creating lots of deadlines, basically.
You're like juggling deadlines given to you by other people with deadlines you maybe want to put on yourself.
Yes, exactly.
What about you, Carolyn? What kind of writer are you?
Well, deadlines definitely help. But I would say that deadlines help, but they also loom in the background, and I go completely in denial. I'm just like, oh, that can't be done. That can't be done. It's not ready yet. Well, I used to, I was just very regimented. I've always been pretty regimented about writing. And then I had kids, and that just kind of went out the window. And that sort of instilled in me this feeling that I just write whenever I can, and now my kids are grown up, and I have much more time, but I am also working about 17 jobs and just doing all sorts of things, book things. And so I find that my life is incredibly hectic. It's just so busy. But I once heard the poet Mark Strand. He came to Sarah Lawrence and he gave a reading, but he announced that he was no longer going to write any poetry. This was a few years before he died. And he said, someone said, well, why aren't you going to write any more poetry? And he said, well, it's because I've run out of things to say. And he did come up with another book after. So he probably didn't run out of everything. But I just remember listening to that and thinking, I've had to work so much in my life. And I raised with my husband, I raised 2 kids. I mean, I could live until I'm 197 and never run out of things to write about, and I don't know if it has to do with being a woman writer versus a man, but I just am like, I could just wake up at any time and just start writing. I feel like I have to grab it at any moment. So it makes me sound a little reckless, but I am pretty regimented about my, and I definitely tell my students they have to write every day. So
yeah. And I had a class with Carol Phillips, and he was like talking, he really like made an impression on me somehow, but he was talking about his writing practice, and he was like, he's pretty prolific, like not the most prolific person ever, but he's written a lot of books. And he was just saying that he would write like for 5 minutes or something, if he had 5 minutes, and he would do it and just like whenever, and like on the plane. I do love writing on the plane. And reading on the plane, but like he would just do it at any moment, even if it was for like 5 or 10 minutes, and it was incredibly useful. And I think too that the like getting I'm trying to like get out of the idea that I should have like my canal scarred would like wakes up at 4 every day and writes for 4 hours, and like that's what he does, and then his kids get up and he helps them or whatever, and I'm trying to get out of this like idea that I need to have a set time of my 4-hour chunk, and if I don't get my 4 hours, then all is doomed, and I should feel really bad about myself, because yes, as you say, the deadlines also loom and they make you feel terrible, and you're like, well, I'm not even living, what can I write about if I don't even live? Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's so funny. We put so much pressure on ourselves to come up with these sort of fake things like, write every day. I'm just teaching a book by Carolyn who was a journalist for the Washington Post. And she has a section, this book is completely crazy. It's just a totally crazy. Part of it is she spends a lot of time talking about getting subject matter, and the subject matter she would like to write is how to murder her second husband. So it's just a really crazy writing manual. But one of the chapters is write 1,000 words a day, and she's really adamant about that. And that's 4 pages, and that's a lot. 4 pages is a lot. If it happens, it's great. Sometimes I write more than 4 pages a day, but to have that, and her form of encouragement is like, write 1,000 words a day. It won't kill you. So it's like totally
True.
mean, but yeah, it could kill you. So I would just say, write what you can, but of course it helps to write regularly to really see how your work is progressing.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of, is there, in these last few minutes, is there anything y'all are working on right now that you can tell us about, or that you've got on the horizon you're excited about?
I had sold a book of essays,
Nice.
so I have to write them.
So now you have to write them.
Yeah, it's really
Congrats.
I had this terrible, I mean, it wasn't terrible, but I was talking to another writer, a novelist over the summer, and I had just sold the book, and it's all new essays. I usually write, as I said, for magazines, and so I'm like, I don't know how long it takes me to write a 4,000 word article. Like, I just write it when I have to. I research it, and then it's like I think about it for a long time, and I feel bad that I haven't written it, and then I write it maybe 4 days later, whatever. That's my process. And I was talking to this other novelist, and she was like, when is your book due? I just sold it maybe in July. She's like, when is your book due? And I was like, in a year. And she was like, so you have to write one essay per month? And I was like, yeah, I guess. And she was like, that's not possible. And I was like, oh no, so maybe it's not possible. I don't know.
We'll see.
Anyway, that's
Well, good luck. Carolyn, what about you?
Well, I have a lot of little deadlines. I actually was asked to contribute to a literary journal on climate change. And so I'm writing a piece of fiction on climate change about a housing project that doesn't want to have recycling bins. And I'm actually having a lot of fun with it, but I don't know, maybe I'm having too much fun with it. But I'm working on another novel and just trying to, the novel is kind of linking the Holocaust and American slavery. And so I'm doing that also in my, free moments. Like a lot of old people, I'm discovering that you don't need as much sleep as you used to. So I am definitely taking advantage of that. So we'll see. Yeah, I got a lot of little things simmering, and thank God for those deadlines. But the novel is just still this big floppy thing that I'm trying to figure out what to do with.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, I look forward to reading both your forthcoming works. That's exciting. We are about out of time. So I just want to thank you all for joining us. This has been great, and I really appreciate the insight to your work. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you to the audience, everyone, for tuning in. Remember to buy books. You can get them through the CAL's website or Wordsworth in the Heights here in Little Rock. Of course, anywhere online. Buy small and local when you can, and support your library when you can. Be sure to follow Carolyn and Lauren on social media and keep up with their upcoming projects. And lastly, I just want to remind everyone the Six Bridges Book Festival is going on through the 31st. There are even more events pretty much every day. There are several events. You can register online for virtual events like this. So be sure to check those out. So thank you again, Lauren. Thank you, Carolyn. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us. Thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. I'm so glad that I got to meet you, Lauren.
Yes, me too. We'll have to talk about Berlin some other time.
Email, definitely.
Standing invitation to Arkansas. Y'all come see us sometime.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Nathan.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate it. Bye, y'all.
Bye.